Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special episode of the Wolfram Student Podcast. I'm Sam.
And I'm Rashang, and we're your hosts. This is the Wolfram Student Podcast, where every fortnight we dive into a new, innovative project done by high schoolers using the Wolfram language.
And for our 10th bonus episode, let's welcome Rohan Mehta, who'll be sharing his project on a sentiment analysis of Marvel TV shows.
So, hi Rohan, it's great to have you here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, your grade, etc.?
Yeah, so like Rushank said, I'm Rohan. I'm a current senior in the East Coast of the US. So I go to school in Pennsylvania. And I got involved with the Wolfram language first through the Wolfram summer camp, actually at the same year as Rushank.
Yeah. Cool. And I remember you were at the summer camp 2021. What have you been doing with Wolfram since then?
Yeah, so I've continued to use Wolfram for a bunch of passion projects and side projects, and that's one of those is going to be what I'm going to share with you today. But I also did an internship at Wolfram Research, and I'm going to be a part of the new Wolfram Institute that's being created. So there I'm doing something kind of different than what I'm talking about today. It's more on the research side of like computational chemistry, but that's also been a really cool opportunity to grow my skills with the Wolfram language.
Oh, congratulations. That's amazing. So given that you have, a lot of experience with the Wolfram language, and, with various aspects of Wolfram, do you have any idea what your favorite Wolfram function might be? Just as a way to break the ice, anything that pops to mind?
I'd say probably fold list, I guess. I think it's a unique function. In most other functional programming languages, it's like the scan function. So I actually was having a hard time sort of figuring out what the scan function was in the Wolfram language until I realized it was named fold list. So I think that's a cool sort of renaming of the scan function. And I like to use that when I can. So I guess I'd say fold list.
Cool, pretty cool. And are there any functions from computational chemistry you would like to share? That sounds like a really interesting field and one that not many high schoolers have much exposure to.
Yeah. So basically the work that I'm doing at least is more about less about like using functions that already exist and more about sort of creating new functions. I guess a cool function that I've created is this function, which it takes sort of the like written form of a chemical reaction, and then it creates a Petri net for that and does a stochastic simulation using it over the Gillespie algorithm. And so that's something like we're hoping to sort of put in a Packlet so that other people could use that eventually. So I think that's a pretty cool function I worked on related to computational chemistry.
Wow, that sounds really cool. Is it available in the function repository or is it going to be rolled out into Wolfram?
Yeah, I think we were talking about what the best way to deploy it is. I think instead of putting it in the function repository, we're going to put it in a Packlet, which is like a mini library you can just import. So it's like a collection of functions because like a bunch of the functions sort of work together. So we thought it might make more sense for that avenue. And that's something we're working on, but we haven't like published it quite yet.
Cool. So it's going to be just the Packlet. But no, that sounds really cool. And yeah, that sounds awesome.
That's pretty amazing. Well then, we'll get into your project now. So just dive right in and tell our listeners about what you've done.
Yeah, sure. So at a core level, I guess my project is really just sort of a basic data science project. What I think makes it a little interesting is sort of what the data science is being applied to. So I'm a pretty big Marvel fan. I like to watch all Marvel TV shows and movies. This past summer, the Disney Plus show Miss Marvel was released. And so I thought that was pretty interesting because it was the first sort of major Marvel motion picture with a predominantly South Asian cast. And so like I felt some sort of connection to that being of the same background. And so I was excited to watch the show. I thought it was pretty good. Obviously, there are plenty of reasons to criticize the show, but a lot of people were saying that the show, Miss Marvel, was being over criticized or review bombed. Basically, like a lot of people were giving it negative reviews just because of its sort of ethnically different and diverse cast. And obviously, I think that's like a compelling thing for like the media to say. But at the same time, sort of being really interested in data science and stuff like that, I was curious if this claim actually was presented well in the data. Like, does the data actually support that claim? And so I decided to sort of investigate with the Wolfram language. And I think the cool thing about Wolfram is like, if you have an idea, it's really just super easy to get started. Like in the first day, I was able to actually start getting some insight into whether or not this was true. But then I was realizing that there are actually a lot of complexities to this. And so this sort of grew from like a one-day exploration into a much larger project. And again, I think it's really cool how Wolfram sort of facilitates that really easily. Like I felt a lot of the time it was just focused on sort of continuing to explore the data rather than like logistical issues and stuff like that. So I guess I'll just quickly walk through sort of how I sort of tackle this challenge to give you a sort of a sense of what it was like for me going through this data. So here's just some initial code. What I did was I selected all sort of the Marvel TV shows that have been published so far. And this was one of the important things to me, is that I wanted to do an analysis across all TV shows, because a lot of news outlets that were issuing claims of review bombing basically only looked at Miss Marvel. But obviously, if you want to draw some sort of trend or conclusion, you need to look at the variance in data across multiple sort of parts of the sample. So these are the names of the TV shows, and these are their links. Wolfram has a really cool import function right here, which I basically just pass in the link, and I did a little extra stuff here to sort of append stuff to the link, because sometimes there are like multiple pages you have to scrape. But basically, the import function just grabs all the HTML associated with that. So I grabbed all the HTML for like user reviews. Users are just people like you or me who are, watching the show casually and posting their opinion. And then critics are people who like review it professionally. And then I just did a bunch of sort of basic data cleaning. So like split out ads. We don't want ads to be in like the HTML that we're scraping. We want to split out spaces, and then we want to convert all that HTML into just a list of reviews, so that we have sort of one review, two review, all in a list. And then we have an association where each show sort of maps to a list of user reviews and a list of critic reviews. And so the first thing I did was actually try and see like what this data looked like. And a really good way to do that is just count how much data you have. I think that's like a pretty basic and essential thing you need to do at the start of any data science project. And so this is what it looked like. And so just to remind you, the purple sort of bars here in this bar chart are for the number of critic reviews, and the blue ones are for the number of user reviews. So critic reviews are a lot less than user reviews, because there's just going to be far fewer critics than users. But you can think of user reviews as like a sort of approximate metric for how much interest a show caused. So Marvel's first TV show, WandaVision, seems to have caused the most interest. Miss Marvel seems to have caused the second most interest. Then all of these shows in the middle are somewhat approximate in terms of the interest they caused. So this was interesting to see. Obviously, it's not too much in the direction we want to go. So another thing in this game,
that is quite interesting to see. And I feel like, I don't know, it's just interesting that, Miss Marvel has a lot of interest from users, but its interest from critics is, not that different from all the other shows. In fact, it's lower than a lot of the other ones. So I feel like that also kind of validates your point about how there was a lot of sort of public discussion about the film as compared to, professional sort of backlash at the, professional criticism of the plot or something like that. I think that's important, because that can, as you've shown us, it can help us sort of fact check or gut check the data pretty much.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And that's basically another way to sort of put that is we can like look at the percentage of total reviews that come from each show. And Miss Marvel has the greatest percentage of user reviews out of total reviews at 88%. So there's, like you were saying, Rushank, there's some sort of instinct here that there's a lot more discussion among users than critics. And if we want to prove that some amount of review bombing is happening, we now have to say that a majority of that discussion was more negative than we would expect. But this sort of is sort of inching us along in the right direction. So it's somewhat encouraging. And again, this is basically just showing the same thing, except the number of reviews, instead of using bars, it's just a line plot. And I just did that, for completeness. It's nice to see some of the trends as a line sometimes, because you can see more clearly like how things change between each data point. So after sort of counting the data and looking at it that way, now it's important to get into like, what are the actual reviews saying, right? So basically what I did is I created a simple function to extract all the numbers that appear in a given review. And again, Wolfram has great pattern matching functionality. So I think a helpful tip is that whenever you're doing something where you need to extract data, always try and use pattern matching. Like in this case, all I have to do is pattern match against a digit character, and then I get all the numbers out of a review. And then, so basically I have these other functions, which are just making sure that we take the first number that we extract, because a review might talk about a bunch of numbers, but the first number, at least on Metacritic, it's always the review score. And we want to make sure that review score is within the appropriate bounds. And so then we just do that for critics and for users. And then we can create this cool chart that you see on the bottom here, which is basically showing for critics, what is the average review score? And so we see that Miss Marvel was rated the highest by critics at around 77.5. It doesn't have too big of a lead though. WandaVision is right on its feet at 77.4, and then Loki bumps down to 74, and then the other ones bump down a few percentage points each time. So basically, what's this is telling us is that Miss Marvel is the best show according to critics. It's neck and neck with WandaVision though, so it might be a little more accurate to say they're both sort of the best show, but they clearly distinguish themselves from all other shows. What's interesting though is then when we do the same thing for users, Miss Marvel actually gets bumped down a bunch. So I feel like I should clarify: critics can rate a score from 0 to 100. Users can only rate a score from a show from 0 to 10. So Miss Marvel has a score of about 40%. Even WandaVision gets bumped down a bit, but it still has a roughly 70% score. And What If, which is second to last here, gets bumped all the way to first place. But we can clearly see that there's a really big drop from Miss Marvel as according to critics, as according to users. And even across all these other shows, it's a pretty significant, like 20% jump to the next show. So this is pretty confusing, right? Because you mostly expect critics to be a lot stricter and more particular than users. So there's definitely some sense that something potentially fishy is going on. And this was sort of the first instinct I had that maybe review bombing really is happening, but to like become more certain that it really is happening, we need to go a bit deeper. And the way I did this was not just looking at, and I can quickly go over this code. It is a bit complicated here, but basically I'm extracting distributions from all the scores. So instead of averaging them all together, I'm keeping them separate as a list and then just plotting those lists as distributions, as histograms or smooth histograms. And this code is really just to help format things. So I think that's another good piece is going to just be formatting stuff well. Data visualization is a really core part of sort of driving your analysis. So manipulating the data is not always going to be the most intensive thing. Anyway, back to the visualization here. When we plot out the distributions, so again, a histogram and a smooth histogram, we see something really crazy happening for Miss Marvel. And I'm just going to expand these so you can get a better sense of that. So this is the distribution according to critics. And you can see it has this really, really high peak, which none of the other shows seem to have. And what that tells us is that there is a lot of concentration on high scores for Miss Marvel as according to critics. So critics thought the show was really, really, really good. And barely any of them thought it was bad. We only have this little blip right here. As according to across other shows, that's not really the case. They tend to look more normal, roughly. And by normal, I mean in the sense of a normal distribution, but I mean, obviously not entirely. That's just a very rough heuristic. Meanwhile, the user distribution has these two like very separate spikes, and we call a distribution like that bimodal. What that means is there is one portion of users who is agreeing with critics and thinking the show is really good, but there's a much larger portion, sort of this hump over here, which thinks it's extremely bad. And we don't really see any bimodal distributions in the user scores for other shows. I guess you see a bit of a bimodal distribution here, but nothing so pronounced with almost equal peaks, although obviously the negative peak is greater here. And so what this is telling us is that there's a lot of tension among users. There is contradiction and conflict. There is a lot of disagreement. And these are exactly the sorts of things we would expect to see if a show is being review bombed, because we're obviously going to have some rational actors which are judging the show based on what they see, and what they see is good quality content. But then we have this larger proportion, this very unnatural size that is voting in the other way. And so this is, I think, a really important hint that review bombing could be happening. Again, it's really difficult to prove like causality with these things. We haven't yet proved that there is a very specific reason that this group exists, but we have proved that this group exists. And so that was an important step for me as I was doing this project.
Yeah, those are very interesting results, actually. And first of all, I just want to say this really felt like a mystery, like from the start. Like it had the suspense of a thriller novel, which was pretty cool. But yeah, it's so pleasing to see the results actually sort of play out and sort of show us a very clear bimodal distribution, as you said. And yeah, I think it would be interesting to see, what if you overlay these plots on top of each other and sort of subtract from each, just subtract the areas of the critic scores and the user scores. So we're going to see where there's the most gap. And I think, on the left peak is like where a lot of users probably purposefully are review bombing Ms. Marvel, and the critics don't really agree with them. But on the right side, you'll see that the critics are really high, and there's not that many users in proportion. But yeah, it's a really interesting visualization. And honestly, I really like the previous one, but I feel like this one is 10 times better because it shows you so much more about the data.
Yeah, thanks. That idea of subtracting the plots is interesting. I did think about that a little bit. I also considered like overlaying smooth and normal histograms. I think the one thing that I found was difficult is just these are on different scales, from 0 to 100 and 0 to 10. So sort of overlapping everything and still making it look nice without the axes getting too crammed is a bit of a challenge, which is why I just ended up not trying to spend so much time in that direction.
No, it's still very clear, the right one, one's on top of the other, so you can still see everything. Yeah. Cool.
So here's just another plot. I won't go into this one that much detail because it's basically showing the same thing. So if you imagine, like, if we look at it horizontally, like if you can see where my cursor is tracing, that's basically the same sort of distribution here. We've just sort of tilted it on its side. And so again, you see Miss Marvel really distinguish itself as very good among critics. And then there's a lot of weight in the negative direction among users. So one interesting thing I tried is I also was curious about how many like extreme scores does a show receive. So like 100 out of 100 or 0 out of 0. So according to critics, WandaVision actually received the most extreme scores, even though Miss Marvel is rated the highest, which is interesting because WandaVision had a lot of like really, really good scores, like 100 out of 100, much more than Miss Marvel. But we saw that Miss Marvel's average critic score is actually greater. And that's because WandaVision also has, sorry, I sort of said that wrong. This is according to critics. This is according to users. So WandaVision had still a lot more 100 out of 100s according to critics, even though Miss Marvel had the greatest average critic score. According to users, WandaVision had a bunch of really good scores, and it's rated really well among users. Miss Marvel also had a substantial amount of good scores, and that sort of confirms what we saw earlier. There is a pretty sizable peak of users who like the show. Then, of course, when we look at 0 out of 0 scores, no critics gave that score because, there's not really much point for a critic to do that, right? Unless the show is like completely terrible. But Miss Marvel had the most sort of 0 out of 0 scores among users of any other show, like by a lot, like 3 or 4 times as many as most other shows.
That's a very pronounced difference right there.
Yeah. So I think by this point we're pretty certain that something's going on. I was a little curious though about like how can we sort of split up all the reviews into different like categories of rated well, rated okay, sort of a neutral zone, and rated really badly. And so I wrote this code here, which essentially sort of categorizes them in that way. I'm not going to go through it again. A bunch of it is really just visualization. Like you can see all the various options here. And it sort of generated this plot over here, which shows 2 columns. So the first column is the composition of user reviews over time. And the second column is the percent composition of user reviews. So if I just like take one of these plots and try and expand it, each dot on that plot is a specific review. And the sort of highlighted area is how much of the total reviews is made up by that type of review. So for WandaVision, even from the beginning, it's all been made up essentially by good reviews. So a lot of blue, we can see all these little dots as distinct reviews. Most shows have a very little yellow area, but the show with the littlest yellow area actually is, or orange, I don't know what you prefer to call that, is Miss Marvel. And that's because of bimodal user distribution. By the way, all of this is user data. I didn't do this for critic data because there's just so few reviews, it doesn't make sense. But a bimodal distribution is going to have very little sort of middle ground. It's going to have 2 extremes, right? And so we can see that this is sort of really dominated by negative reviews. And again, if we look at the percent composition from like 60 to 100%, so there's about 40% of reviews dominated by negative reviews. I can't really completely read on these axes, but these are very,
these are very pronounced results, as you said. Do you want to go a bit over the code that you use?
Sure, I can go quickly over it.
Yeah, like I know said, it's a lot of code that is used to beautify everything, but just
I do have sort of all of this code with comments on my website because they made a short post about it. So I definitely recommend. I think it's pretty well documented, so I definitely recommend going into it if you want to get in some greater detail. Basically, what I do is, so I transform my initial association to map into the dates of reviews instead of like the whole like textual content of the review. And then I sort of apply this function, which it counts a review as good for a user if it has a score of greater than or equal to 7. So you can see that right here. And then if it's greater than or equal to 4, but obviously less than 7, it's medium, otherwise it's bad. I apply that function. Then I transform the association one more time to sort of like turn it into a format where all of the good, bad, and negative reviews are sort of listed out. And then I really just use a date plot to a dateless plot, to put all of that data into this format here. So it's really just a lot of sort of manipulating the data to be in the right format. But what I was interested in then
And
is,
I'll definitely put the link to that post in the description, so our
yeah,
listeners can check it out. And if you want to go into even greater detail, so thanks for that.
yeah, that sounds like a good idea. So what I really wanted to do now is like, we're pretty sure that some review bombing is happening, right? But we want to prove something more about the causation of this. We want to prove that there's some intention behind the user's reactions or actions rather. So I had two ideas for how to do this. My first idea was, it seems intuitive to me that like if a user wants to review bomb a show, they're going to write a really short review because that will allow them to like pump out a bunch of reviews. So I was curious if there's any relationship among the length of a review and its score. And it turned out there actually wasn't, which was really surprising to me. And the reason for that was something that had to do with how users could post reviews, which I wasn't even aware of. So this was like a place where analyzing the data helped me sort of correct an assumption I made that I didn't even realize was wrong. And so I'll take you through that quickly as well. So basically what we do now is we change that association to map from the name of a show to the length of its review. So you can see here, I'm taking the string length, and that's just the length in characters. And so I then filtered out each show's good, bad, and good and bad reviews and sort of did a similar histogram. This wasn't that helpful, so I'm just going to quickly gloss over that. But I think you'll find a lot of times that a lot of data visualization just leads you into dead ends. They're difficult to interpret. And usually that doesn't mean the data doesn't have a trend in it necessarily. It might just mean you're using the wrong sort of lens to visualize it. So I just kept this code in here to sort of give you a sense that a lot of times you're going to run into dead ends. This was a dead end for me. I wasn't really able to tell anything interesting from this data. But what I was able to do was sort of replot that data as this stacked bar chart of all user reviews. And so these are all negative user reviews. And for each show, we're trying to see how many characters. So here you can see like 0 to 500 characters, 1,000 characters, et cetera, how many reviews are concentrated across those character ranges. So for example, Miss Marvel seems to have a lot of like weight in these sort of low character areas. And that is tempting to say that might be some proof of review bombing. But what we have to also keep in mind is that Miss Marvel just has a lot more reviews, negative user reviews than other shows. So it may look like it has more stuff there, but it might just have a greater total amount of reviews and it has the same percentage. So to sort of verify that, we can draw this other plot here where we actually look at the percentage. And this is a complicated plot, so I'll take a minute to describe that. But we're looking at the percentage of each show's negative reviews in different character ranges. So this little red range here is shows from reviews from 0 to 100 characters. And so there's obviously going to be super few reviews like that because you can't really say that much in 0 to 100 characters. 100 to 200 characters is this orange area right here. But we see that Miss Marvel actually doesn't have the greatest percentage of these short 100 to 200 character reviews. That actually goes to this other show called Moon Knight with a 40% sort of concentrated in that character length range. The thing is that Moon Knight just has very few reviews to begin with. So this 40% figure is probably just inflated by a very small population size. And I began to notice this was sort of a general thing, like Moon Knight and What If, like they seem to have these really whopping percentages, but that's just because they have so few reviews to begin with. What we can say though is like the overall area of all these yellow areas seems to be the same across all shows. The overall orange, I guess, the overall yellow area here is also pretty similar. So we're not seeing any really distinct differences in the percentages across different sort of character bins. And that was surprising to me. I even did this other thing here, and I'll quickly go through it as well. It's really easy in the Wolfram language to create sort of regression lines. So you can create a model, a linear model here by just using linear model fit and putting in sort of the two things you want to fit. And then with that, you can create regression lines. And I also plotted the actual data points behind all of them. And so we can see there's basically no correlations here. This is the user score, so 0 to 10, and the user length. If a show is being review bombed, we might expect low scores, so like 0 to have low character counts, and high scores to have higher character counts. So we might expect something with a positive R value. Again, we see like R squared coefficients of like 0.000. So there's like no correlations here, save What If, and to remind you, that is because like look how few data points it has. So it's really pretty spurious. So I was finding like no connections here, which was really surprising to me. And then what I realized later on was actually that users can, if they want to rate a show, they don't necessarily have to include a textual review. So if you really wanted to review bomb the show, you would probably just like spam a bunch of negative reviews without actually adding a textual review count. And a textual review body. And so I wasn't aware of that because all the data I was scraping was from the reviews with textual counterparts. So it was kind of like just an ill-posed question to investigate this, because if people really wanted to review bomb, they would just not leave a review at all. So we wouldn't really expect there to be too much of a concentration on low reviews. If they really just wanted to pump out a bunch of reviews, they just wouldn't leave a review.
Right.
So this was,
and we kind of see that happening too, because we don't see a correlation here, but we do see a correlation in the distribution. And in the distribution, you used all reviews, right? Not just the ones with text attached. So the fact that we saw a lot of low reviews there, but we don't really see any correlation between the length and score, maybe that means, maybe that's sort of proof of what you're talking about, which is people would just give a number instead of any text.
Well, actually, all the data I used was from textual reviews, because you can only scrape the reviews with textual reviews. You can't just scrape reviews with only a number. But if you actually go on Metacritic, what you'll find is that like the average score that Metacritic calculates is even lower than what we calculate. And that's because they're including all of those reviews without a textual counterpart. Right. So what you are saying is correct in some sense, because there's a lot of negative reviews that we're not even accounting for with this. So yeah.
Well, that's interesting. So even so you only had in your data, you only had reviews with a text component, but that still had sort of a negative peak for what's this show again? Miss Marvel. And so that kind of shows that maybe people are willing to sort of rant on for a while, even if they hate the show. Something
right. And I sort of mentioned that in like sort of the text here, that I think it was an oversimplification on my part to like assume. I mean, this was just like an intuition I had that like negative reviews would have a low count, because at the same time, negative reviews are probably going to be like people who are maybe sort of like internet crazy, and they just want a space to like put like a whole speech in there about like why they hate the show. So I think there's just like so much variability on the length of a review. And you also have to keep in mind that sometimes not all of these reviews are even written in English. So, there's variations in language, which could have a part in it. And I think there's just like so many factors. It's really unlikely that you'd see some sort of clean, distinct, clear-cut association in this data.
Yeah, fair. But it's always worth it to sort of investigate questions and see where that leads us. Yeah, great effort.
Yeah, and that's, like I said, this was mainly just sort of a roadblock, but I left it in that overall result because I think it's important to like show people what the actual process looks like, not just the results all the time. So I wanted to still get some sense that there is an intention behind what people are doing. And I was able to do it with this sort of last investigation I did, because reviews on Metacritic are also reviewed, if that makes sense. Like you can upvote a review or downvote a review. So I was curious, like, how does the sort of frequency with which reviews are upvoted versus downvoted correlate with their score? So just like I extracted the actual score from a review, I can also extract its review upvote rate. And so here's a little pattern I used to do this. Basically, I extract a number out of a number users found this review helpful. So like it might be 7 out of 9 users found this review helpful. That means 7 people upvoted the review, but 2 people downvoted the review. So 7 people found it helpful out of 9, 7 people upvoted it, 2 people downvoted it. And so we can extract that information from each review. And again, this is a really powerful use case of pattern matching. Like
I was literally just about to say that. Like this is such a difficult thing to extract if you don't have
in any other programming language, really. Yeah. So it's really cool to just be able to like put that in and then like a 3-line function. So then again, I sort of just cleaned this data a little bit. Like, for example, if a show didn't have any votes, if a review didn't have any upvotes or downvotes, then I couldn't use it in this sort of analysis. So I just had to like filter it out. And you can just do that, like map it to nothing here. And then I converted each association to be of the form like mapping to the actual score of the review and then upvotes out of total votes. So that I called it's like upvote rate. And then again, I generated these linear models using a regression line. And so this time we actually start to see a pretty distinct trend. So it's not necessarily linear, as in the fact that we have like a clump, and usually linear would be sort of spread out along the line. But basically what we're seeing here is that there's a very clear directionality to the data, more so than it might be linear, I guess. But it does have high R-squared value in most cases. So again, these are the user review scores, and that is the upvote rating of a review. So if it's a 1 out of 1, that means like 10 out of 10 users upvoted it. If it's a 6 out of 0.6, then that means like 6 out of 10 users upvoted that specific review. So what we see is that for reviews with low scores,
and to clarify, it doesn't have to be sort of 6 out of 10. It's just like 3 out of 5, for example, something.
Yeah,
It's
and
like 60%.
I noted that as a limitation of like how I'm doing this, because for example, this review might be 100 out of 100. This one could be 1 out of 1, and they both get mapped to 1%. Sorry, like a full 1 out of 1. So that's sort of a limitation, not 1%, 100%. That's sort of a limitation of this method, but I couldn't really think of a much better way to do it. So obviously a review with a 1 out of 1 review rate and 100 out of 100, 100 out of 100 obviously has a much more weight, but to keep everything simple and linear, I sort of just mapped them to the same score of like 1. So that is a limitation I made note of. But what we see is that reviews with really low scores have a very low upvote rate. So that means people didn't like those reviews very much. They didn't find them very helpful, and they had a lot more downvotes than upvotes. And so that tends to, I guess, corroborate the idea that a lot of these more negative reviews might be like just people ranting, right? And people are like, this is not helpful to me. I obviously like notice that this user maybe has some like preconceived biases or something, or they just want to make the show look bad, or I don't know, they have some sort of issue. So I don't find this review very helpful. So we see that trend across most shows. Again, for Hawkeye and Moon Knight, these are 2 shows with like very few reviews. So we see some spurious connection in the downward direction. For Miss Marvel, though, we see a connection in the downward direction, but it's much more extreme, especially in terms of the number of reviews we have. And so what this is saying is that scores with lower reviews actually tend to have a higher helpfulness rating than scores with higher ratings, than reviews with higher ratings, sorry. So we have reviews that may give Miss Marvel a 0 or a 1 out of 10, and they get upvoted a lot more than reviews that give Miss Marvel a 10 out of 10, for example. So I think this is a pretty good sense that there is sort of intention behind what is happening here. And I think this gives us enough evidence to really call it review bombing, because we see that these users are creating a bimodal user distribution, and we see that they're essentially sort of collaborating together to highly upvote negative reviews, but highly downvote positive reviews. And so when you take all this evidence together, I think you can be pretty certain that review bombing is happening from a statistical point of view. And that's sort of disregarding all of like the social and cultural evidence of people saying certain things on social media and making certain comments, et cetera, which makes it clear that review bombing is happening from that point of view. But from the mathematical and data science point of view, I think we get to a point where we can really be pretty sure that there is review bombing happening. And, you know, if you just want to sort of look at the textual content of these reviews, and I'm just going a little quickly now because we don't have too much time left, we see that if you look at reviews that rate it highly, there is a lot of focus in the word clouds of those reviews on like the characters, the story arc, the very good acting, the sort of cultural richness of the show, whereas bad reviews tend to focus a lot more on themes of sort of race and politics, again, which supports the narrative that people were pushing, that review bombing does sort of stem from people not necessarily taking to the more diverse cast. But I think when we back that up with sort of all the statistical analyses we went through over here, we can be a lot more sure that really is happening. And I think it's important that we do this because, like, in today's society where things are so polarized, lots of people just want to make claims about stuff. And especially in themes of race and politics, people are always, I think, sort of at each other's throats. So I think it, even like, for example, me having a cultural connection to the show, I was probably inclined to agree that it was being review bombed. I think it's always important that we like sort of remember that any instincts we have need to be supported by the data and sort of show a commitment to going through the data. And so that's really what I wanted to do with this project. And it was a lot of fun for me to sort of marry my interests in data science with this sort of cultural connection. And I had a lot of fun doing it.
Wow. Yeah, that is such a wonderful conclusion, honestly. It on the surface, it might have seemed like, just a sort of interesting exploration. But yeah, as you mentioned, it leads into so much more. And it talks about how we as a society should value more objective analyses and place a greater value in them than we do right now. Obviously, we should also consider all the social cultural aspects, as you mentioned.
Right.
Yeah, that was great. That was wonderful. Thank you so much for going through your entire project and talking about each part of the code, talking about every step, even every dead end that you, I'm sure there were a lot more, but some of the dead ends that you encountered. So thank you so much for doing that. I was curious if you had any thoughts about how our listeners could start learning the Wolfram language and perhaps getting involved in projects, because I feel like you have a knack for sort of finding ideas that really click, that really make you want to keep working. For example, with the Miss Marvel sentiment analysis, that seems like a really fun idea. And it's something that people would actually want to sort of dedicate their time to versus some random sort of generic IT project. So what are your tips for anyone starting off with Wolfram?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So first thing I'd say is like try and find other people whose projects inspire you. And I think there's obviously a lot of great places you can look for that online for the Wolfram language, like the Wolfram community. There are like hundreds of posts there every day, and those are great to check out. Um, I also am really inspired personally by Christopher Wolfram's projects. So he has a really cool website, and he does a lot of cool stuff in the Wolfram language. A lot of his projects are like applying sort of computational analysis to like things in society or things in politics. And so that somewhat inspired the vein of this project as well. But I think you really need to look for people whose projects inspire you, because that's definitely what's shaped the projects I've done so far. And then second, try and figure out what interests you as well. I think like even if you're new to coding in the Wolfram language, you can still do a project that's interesting to you. That's really not true in other programming languages because you have to learn so much stuff. But since the Wolfram language has so much pre-built-in functionality, you can be a pretty much a beginner and still sort of explore something that's interesting to you. Whereas like in Python, if you're a beginner, you obviously can't do that much yet. That's sort of like actually interesting and you have to go through all the basics first. So like I really wouldn't recommend learning the Wolfram language by going through a bunch of exercises and doing the basics, but try to find something that seems interesting to you, like a current event, some like data set, something about maybe chemistry or physics, and you want to do some sort of like analysis of it or explore it in a computational way and try and let the project sort of drive how you learn. I think that is a really great way to work with the Wolfram language. And I mean, that's basically like what we do in the Wolfram summer camp. We choose a project and sort of let that drive learning the language. Like most of us don't really know Wolfram that well when we join the camp. So I recommend sort of taking that approach, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a really nice thing as part of the Wolfram language. And yeah, I like how it's very beginner friendly, the Wolfram language. So it's nice to hear about how all our listeners can get involved with it.
Great. Thank you so much for that insightful piece of work you showed us there. And yeah, thank you so much for your time. Being able to explain all that code in detail is no easy task. So thank you so much for being here again. And I was wondering if you had any future projects you would like to try with Fulcrum, any ideas for, what you might want to do, any new sort of ideas you have in your mind, just anything.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm somewhat, I guess, interested in continuing to try and expand the Miss Marvel project. Like I'm interested in getting feedback on it from people, maybe even sort of like working with Marvel in some way to see like how this can be used to help sort of increase diversity and representation in the content they put out. But in terms of projects that aren't related to the project I just shared, I'm also really interested in, like I mentioned at the beginning, sort of computational chemistry. And one of the projects that I'm probably going to start with Wolfram research soon is with this really cool company called Emerald Cloud Lab. And basically, this is like this lab they have in the cloud, and you can like write Wolfram language code to like conduct chemistry and biology experiments in that lab. So that's something that I think is like pretty awesome. It almost feels like it's out of sci-fi. So that's a project I'm probably going to start in the next month or so, and I'm really excited about that.
Wow, that really does sound super cool.
Yeah.
Best of luck for that.
Yeah, we wish you good luck in that endeavor and anything else you're planning to do in the future with Wolfram. Thank you so much for coming on today and sharing your entire project with us. It was really amazing, and we were glad to have you. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Wolfram Student Podcast. We hope you learned something new and took away insights from today's discussion. If you want to be featured in a future episode, please fill out the form at tinyurl.com/WSP-interest-form.
And make sure to keep an eye out for the next season of the Wolfram Student Podcast, likely to air sometime in February or March. Once again, thanks for listening.